Today's talk, I'll be presenting research from this forthcoming book, Presumed Criminal: Black Youth in the Justice System in Postwar New York. In it, I point to a critical shift in the carceral turn between the 1930s and the 1960s, when state responses to juvenile delinquency increasingly criminalized Black youths and tethered their lives to a justice system that became less rehabilitative and more punitive. And just as an aside, I used the language of tether well before Jordan Peele did in Us. For those who haven't seen it yet, you'll get it after you do. And as the project came together, I realized that the work was making three important interventions, right? First, I really wanted to kind of challenge the notion that racial criminalization was predominantly a Southern phenomenon. And so to do so, my work joins other historians of the urban North to demonstrate just how New York City in this period compares to other US cities north of the Mason-Dixon line, where citizens all kind of confronted, resisted, and challenged the racial status quo. This Jim Crow North literature continues to reveal how the supposed bastion of liberalism became a pivotal battleground in the post-war push for racial equality. So this included, but was not limited to, contests over fair housing, public schools, and the criminal justice system, right? All spaces that directly impacted the lives of its Black youths. Second, I wanted to bridge a historiographical gap in juvenile justice history between the Great Depression and the Great Society. That is, many historians who examine the juvenile justice system, and often criminal justice more broadly, tend to focus on earlier historical periods. A lot of the literature around juvenile delinquency tends to focus either on the progressive era, in particular looking at this kind of child-saving moment, or hops right into kind of the 1950s, where there was this heightened sense of juvenile delinquency paranoia. And more recently, we've seen folks kind of start their narrative around the war on crime. So for me, it was important to kind of cover this gap, right? What was going on between the 1930s and the 1960s. And to kind of not want to fall into the trap of getting too far forward, I actually wrote the last chapter first, and I deliberately ended in 64, mostly because I was afraid of kind of falling too far forward into the present, right? And I knew I wanted to kind of work this transitional moment, if you will. One of my readers returned a report and was just like, if you make it into 1965, and I was like, no, I know. That's what I didn't want to do. So that was one of the pushbacks I was able to get out of. And then finally, in Presumed Criminal, I wanted to broaden the scope of the carceral state, right? To really include historical actors beyond just the justice system. And so scholars often use this term carceral, which at its core means of or related to prisons, right? But they use it to invoke a wide range of punitive state action. And so this includes, but is not limited to, policing, border patrol, public and private surveillance, incarceration, as well as restrictive and means-tested welfare and social service policy, right? With links to broader systems of criminal and juvenile justice. And today's presentation will focus a lot on the early parts of the book, right? On this pre-World War II moment. So if anyone does have questions about the post-war moment or the latter parts of the book, please do feel free to ask them during Q&A. With that being said, I use the term carceral throughout the monograph in reference to the criminalization of Black youth, right? This process, right? And the interaction between different actors. And then from there, I use labels cautiously like Black youth and juvenile delinquency throughout the monograph, knowing that they have kind of two different relationships, right? We understand these terms as they relate to larger structural conditions, but we also have to understand them as being defined by the local practices of everyday life. So I do use Black, much like the proper noun African American. However, it is employed throughout the monograph or throughout the study in reference to those connected to the African diaspora as well. I use youth to refer to young men and women up through their early 20s. However, especially in legal proceedings, there is often variation across race and gender. And then finally, I use juvenile delinquency, generally in reference to the antisocial behaviors and criminal acts committed by youths that have been categorized by the state. And while I've attempted to analyze the complexities of race, class, and gender in the text, young men do constitute the main subjects of my study. Young men like David Campanella, who told the arresting police officers that, quote, "I just got mixed up with some jerky kids," when he was arrested for his role in a Queens brawl. According to police reports, the 15-year-old son of former Brooklyn Dodger catcher Roy was one of 6 boys involved in a fist fight in a vacant parking lot of a bowling alley in Queens. There were no weapons involved and there were no injuries reported, but the media coverage of the incident varied as the young Campanella was subject to legal proceedings for the fight. Still, even with his well-known surname, the black youth faced tremendous hardship both in the court of justice as well as in the court of public opinion. The first public accounts of the parking lot scuffle were printed by the New York dailies, the New York Times and the New York Herald Tribune, with Campanella's photograph displayed and his name stamped in the headlines. There was not much discrepancy in terms of what happened on that day. However, the characterization of those involved did differ. As reported by the Herald Tribune, David walks into the Maple Ways bowling alley and he issued a challenge to a group of white boys. These white guys turned out to be part of another gang, but I'll talk about that here in a second. But David was said to have been a leader of the Chaplains, which was a Queens gang of, quote, Negro and Puerto Rican youths. And the reason for the clash, according to the Herald Tribune, was that the Chaplains had been upset that their territorial rights were being taken over, right, by this unidentified rival gang in the bowling alley. That unidentified rival gang was the Champions. It was a white gang, or a gang of white youths who resided in the same neighborhood as the Chaplains. The New York Times coverage of the incident proclaimed that the Champions were actually said to have called the fight 1 week earlier to protest the presence of these black and Puerto Rican youngsters in the Flushing bowling alley. The Champions considered the bowling alley their territory, and they engaged Campanella and his guys when they entered the Maple Ways bowling alley. One of the white boys who fought against the Chaplains, Mike O'Neill, told the police, quote, "We were lounging around the bowling alley when Campanella and his 2 friends walked in. Campanella did all the talking. He said he wanted to build up a reputation in the neighborhood. And he wanted 3 of us to fight him and his guys. 3 of us said we would, and we did. 14 youths between the ages of 15 and 20 were all booked at the Flushing precinct on charges of disorderly conduct. They were arraigned in the night court, and they were paroled to their parents' custody. And all of them were paroled except for David. The police had escorted David to the Bronx Youth House, but did not release him to the custody of his mother, Ruth, when she arrived to pick him up. Mrs. Campanella refused to talk to reporters and the authorities at the youth house, and they did not immediately disclose why the young Campanella was not discharged. Later, it was learned that David was detained for his role in the skirmish, and then he had made some damaging admissions concerning a burglary of a drugstore just 1 week prior. A domestic relations judge explained to David that you must understand you've been found a juvenile delinquent. And if you get into any further trouble and are returned to the children's court, you have my word, boy, you will be dealt with very severely. Following a 2.5-hour hearing, David was let go without a warning, or with warning, and his mother told reporters that this was going to break his father's heart. Roy Campanella was one of the first black modern-era Major League Baseball players, and he had worked many years with youngsters, mostly in New York City, to curb juvenile delinquency. In an interview with Jet Magazine, Campy explained why it was important to him to work with his kids around the country during his Dodgers playing days. For years, I have been lecturing in YMCAs and boys clubs and to kid groups about walking the straight and narrow. I felt I was making a contribution towards solving a really serious problem in American life. But like any father, Roy was forced to re-examine this picture of juvenile delinquency when he faced the problem firsthand. And so after his son, David, was released, Roy told New York Times reporters everything else compared to this was nothing. The Campanellas scolded their son for his misbehaviors, but at the same time, they understood the role of his reputable status, right, that played in the situation. Defending her son in court, Mrs. Campanella affirmed that the charges were, quote, blown up out of proportion because of his name. Their attorney agreed. Objecting to the high bail that the Campanellas had to pay, William O'Hara told the reporters that he wondered, quote, what would have happened to this boy if his name were Johnny Jones? Though it is difficult to know for certain to what extent his family name affected the court's response to his wrongdoings, the press indeed played on his name. They objected to their own rule not to publish the names of juveniles that were punished for a crime, and as well as printing his picture in the newspaper, right? You're not supposed to do that. So the managing editor of the New York Times, Turner Catledge, disclosed, quote, "It is not the purpose of newspapers to prevent crime or to sell any philosophy to the public. We in New York have much less to apologize for than if we had not printed the name. Names do make news." Ultimately, the court dismissed the charges against all 14 youths, including David, as long as they weren't involved in any more gang fights. Young Campanella was judged a juvenile delinquent because of his role in the drugstore robbery. And after that, he was put on all types of curfews, right? He wasn't allowed to hang out with friends on the weekends, had mandatory school attendance, right? As well as this, and any deviation from these conditions would send him right back or right into a reform school. And so, but the over-proceeding justice of the juvenile court or the domestic relations court at the time told both Ruth and Roy that they didn't expect him to get any special treatment as the son of his father, and that he should get any chance as any other boy, right? And Justice Lease was right. David did deserve the same chance as any other boy. And though the coverage of the case was exacerbated because of his name, Campanella's experience weren't actually that different, right? They were actually a lot more common than what other black youths at the mid-century encountered with this kind of carceral state growing. The things that got him in trouble were out of the ordinary, right? David had similar interests as other youths. He was interested in playing music. He didn't like sports, which kind of made Roy a little upset and jealous. But his attitude toward authority did reflect the familiar distrust that youth of color retained, and the public was interested in why. A Washington Post editor wrote, quote, "Even the scars of his race must have been slighter for him since his father was so conspicuous an example of how deep-rooted prejudice can be overcome by merit and personality." Still, it was difficult for the public to understand how a youth like Campanella, who did not fit these usually ascribed factors, right? Parental neglect, unfavorable environment, and so on. How did he become delinquent? And so Presumed Criminal tries to answer this question, right? That is, why were there so many more youths finding themselves ensnared in this justice system? Why was the juvenile justice system becoming so much more punitive than it at least appeared to be in the early parts of the 20th century? And how did it become so expansive? For David and the thousands of black youths like him, it was well before the war on crime that they found themselves navigating a justice system that was constantly being shaped and reshaped by extension, never revisions, and by punishment, never prevention. And Campanella's story is one that I use in the introduction because it captures kind of the various layers and the various complexities that the criminalization process goes through. And it also exposes the various historical actors that were involved. And so I start Presumed Criminal in the 1930s, not as an origin story, but as an important, pivotal, and often overlooked decade for juvenile justice history. By 1932, there were all but 2 states that had established a juvenile court system, a separate juvenile court system, I should say. And it was believed that there was no need to implement any kind of federal legislation for juvenile court or for juvenile delinquency because young people generally didn't commit federal offenses. But that changed in 1938. And we see the first federal legislation come down with the Federal Juvenile Delinquency Act. And on the surface, this act just reinforced what states had already been doing. They wanted to separate young people from the criminal justice system or from the adult criminal justice system if, in fact, they committed any federal offenses. But some historians and criminologists who look at the Federal Juvenile Delinquency Act of 38 actually make the case that it's insignificant because, again, young people just don't commit federal offenses. At least they weren't committing them in the 1930s. But where the act was significant, I argue, is that it forced states to revisit its established statutes, right? So a lot of these statutes come into play in the late 19th century and then early parts of the 20th century. And by the 1930s, because the federal legislation comes down, it kind of forced states to kind of look to see if they were doing things in the right way. And this was important in New York City because this is a moment that we see kind of tensions between two camps, right? We have on the one side those who made efforts to extend progressive era ideas on how to approach crime, right? It was a matter of correcting social ills, right, to attend to crime and delinquency in the city. And then on the other side, there were those who were trying to anticipate or trying to predict a rise in criminal behaviors. And they believed it was imperative to increase carceral sovereignty or carceral rule to prevent all these quote unquote potential problems. And both of these approaches offered peril and promise for Black youths, mostly because the juvenile court system as it stood then was rather impartial, right? It gave judges total discretion. There was no trial by jury or any of these things. And what this meant for a lot of Black youths who found themselves in front of a juvenile judge is that they found themselves often in front of a white guy who didn't often display empathy. And even though a lot of judges, especially juvenile judges, kind of were heralded for kind of practicing progressive politics, we see that similarly situated youths did receive different sentences based on the mood, on the temperament, and on the personal philosophy of individual judges. And by the end of the decade, this mattered because roughly 37% of the cases brought forth to the juvenile court involved Black youths, right? And neither the representation nor the allotted resources for young offenders matched this disparity. Black judges were rare, right? Black judges who were assigned juvenile cases were even more so. Not to mention access to kind of resources to prevent delinquency were often shunned to Black youths if they weren't, because a lot of these places were private. And so what this meant was that the fate of delinquent youths lie in the hand of white judges. And this mattered up until the end of the 30s, but then Mayor LaGuardia, who's pictured here, makes a huge decision. He appoints Jane Bolin to New York City's Domestic Relations Court in 1939, and entering a world in which she would be the only African-American woman judge for the next 2 decades. Bolin's appointment marked a pivotal moment that connected the diminishing progressive era child-saving efforts with the emerging civil rights movement. Her upbringing prepared her to be the first African-American woman judge in U.S. history. And her papers give a lot of insight. So her papers are housed at the Schomburg Center, and if anybody's interested in biographies, Jacqueline McLeod writes a phenomenal biography of her life, right, and her kind of trajectory through navigating this space, right? So she holds court in New York City for 4 decades, right? She gets 4 10-year appointments. So she's around for a while. And as one of the main judges in the domestic relations court, she presided over hearings that involved the total spectrum, right? So these included crimes that were committed by juveniles, whether we're talking about homicides or other crimes, but it also meant she looked over cases about non-supportive wives and children. She saw cases about battered spouses, neglected children, adoptions, paternity suits, right? So the domestic relations court saw all kind of incidents or all kinds of cases, right? Not just criminal cases. But it was imperative to Bolin that the Black youths in the city, right, she needed to advocate for change and bring their concerns to the site of city responsibility. But like many Black leaders in the first half of the 20th century, these efforts to attain racial progress were laden with race-neutral rhetoric, right? So she wanted to make change from her position, and she contended for a better balance of representation, but she didn't want to necessarily challenge these things directly. She is on the record for saying, quote, "I am a judge not of Harlem, nor the children of Harlem, but for the whole city and for all children who are in trouble." And even so, as the demographics of those who found themselves in the children's court went from mostly white immigrant youths to Black, the representation of authoritative figures mattered for most in principle, but for many in practice. In practice, perhaps her most significant achievements regarding youth crime involved the assignment of probation officers and investigating, if you will, private child care agencies that were accepting youth without regard to race and religious backgrounds. And so the probation officer case is funny because ultimately the probation officer is the judge's right hand, right, in dealing with a lot of these cases. And for a while there, the domestic relations court in New York City often assigned cases, right? So they gave black youths to black probation officer, they gave white youths to white probation officers. And on the surface, it seemed like the quote unquote right thing to do, except as the numbers increased of black youths, then those black probation officers had case files that were massive versus the white probation officers, being more of them, had more manageable cases, right? And so what we see is kind of an overburden of these black probation officers, and Bolin wanted to change that, and effectively she does. The other big thing about, she forces the city to look at how it kind of categorized its youths before they were placed in child reform spaces. And so ultimately, whenever you got put into the system, you had to fill out this sheet, and on these sheets, they were called face sheets, you had to designate your race, right? Whether you're black, whether you're Puerto Rican, and these folders would actually have a big N or a big PR on every black and Puerto Rican youth. So Bolin said you have to get rid of this, right? If in fact you're gonna get any state funds, you have to change this policy. And so this kind of forced a lot of places in New York City to either use private funds and not accept public funds, or they had to desegregate their spaces. And again, another kind of victory, sure, but it's not like that those were the only racial markers, right, that we could see in these files, right? We had addresses and we knew where most black kids lived, right? We had names, we had familial backgrounds, so there were other racial markers that were involved, but it was still kind of a win to remove these from the case files or from the face files. And so on the other side were those that were anticipating this rise in criminal behavior, right? And they knew that they wanted to kind of capture this or prevent this kind of growing crime problem. And a lot of this is seen through preventive policing, right? So we see an expansion of the police powers in most cities at this time, and they do so in a way that they categorize, or at least they frame, that they want to prevent future crime problems. And in this case, right, we see it in various organizations, right? There were religious organizations involved, social organizations involved, and there were even recreational agencies involved, right? And so in New York City, one of these organizations leading the way was the Juvenile Aid Bureau. So it's tough to see kind of on the police officer's collar, but there's a pin that he's wearing that says JAB, right? And JAB stands for Juvenile Aid Bureau. And so what the Juvenile Aid Bureau does was twofold. One, they were committed to controlling crime-contributing community conditions, right? And two, they wanted to treat those that were designated potential delinquents. And in order to achieve these goals, it was suggested that they had to extend their surveillance into various communities, at least those communities that were marked as high delinquency areas. And so to conduct social investigations of these reported cases, they did, right? And so one of their big kind of overarching goals was getting involved in leading and growing the police athletic leagues in New York City, right? And so the police athletic leagues were they're still around today, right? Known as PAL, right? And that's not an accident, right? They want to make policemen seem friendly. They take them out of their uniforms, they tell them play with the kids, right? Kind of break down this idea that kids might have around police officers. But as one can imagine, this also increased contact with police officers. And police officers are the frontline soldiers for entering kids into the justice system, right? And so there's sort of this catch-22, right? It seems well-intended, but in practice, it ultimately leads to kind of higher numbers of arrest, right? Higher numbers of kind of contact between black youths, right? I love this image for a lot of that reason, right? We see kind of a well-intended black police officer, right, lining up black youths, right, and kind of pointing them out to play on a team here, right? And on the paper it seems harmless, but again, it kind of builds this constant contact between black youths and the police state. And so, in Presumed Criminal, I do reveal this kind of range of societal forces, right, if you will, such as politicians, print media, social scientists, celebrities, athletes, who all kind of join carceral authorities in directing the public discourse on youth crime. This not only influenced theoretical constructions of criminality, that is, reaffirming who was presumed criminal, but it also shaped public policies connected to this post-war crime problem. By the 1950s, various agencies and organizations, both formal and informal, put forth efforts to combat youth crime as they saw fit. And these range from large institutional endeavors such as the YMCA to some on-the-ground organizing by the youths themselves. And so I spend a great deal of the latter half of the book talking about various crime prevention programs that emerged in this period. Because by the 1950s, there was little doubt that the nation faced a growing, quote-unquote, delinquent problem. It was the response to these problems that needed some more kind of digging, if you will. And so various agencies tried to tackle these problems with this one-size-fits-all approach, right? They thought recreation, right? We often hear kind of people turn to crime for three reasons, right? Lack of employment opportunities, inadequate education, lack of recreational spaces, right? That's why young people are turning to crime. We've heard that rhetoric since the late 19th century. The problem is the state is often willing to fix the last one, right? The state is almost often, every time they're approached with this, right, they're like, okay, we'll give them more parks, right? We'll let them play more sports, right? And we kind of see this regularly. And so this is the moment where I'm kind of making a nod toward what the next project is actually that I'm working on, is what then happens when Black professional athletes enter these spaces, right? And preach to these young kids, right, of sports as kind of this way out, right? It's a rhetoric that sports can offer this alternative avenue to crime, as if sports isn't limiting in terms of your own social mobility, right? And so we kind of see this kind of catch-22 because now it's Black athletes that are kind of playing the role or the conduit for the state to then preach this method, right, to young people. And Jackie Robinson is one of those, right? So Jackie Robinson in the 1940s and 50s is involved. Him and Roy Campanella work at the Harlem YMCA 6 days a week in their off season, right? They literally are there every day. And Robinson often reminisced of his own childhood and knowing that he needed kind of sports to kind of get him on the straight and narrow. And he says that it was that idle time that he had as a kid. His mom worked, his dad was busy, right? And he always had this idle time, and he had two choices. He can either play sports or he can get in trouble, right? And so he chose to play sports. And even so, right, on his, so we see Robinson kind of use these ideas through the early parts of his playing days. And he does so in very structured ways, right? He ended up starting a program called Athletes for Juvenile Decency. He had a radio show where he brought young people on regularly. He was really using his platform, and he was even talking about opening up his own boys club toward the end of his career. But Robinson, like Campanella, had his own demons, right? Like he had a son that had trouble with the law, right? Jackie Jr. was arrested several times, and he ended up joining the military to kind of get out of it. He goes to Vietnam. He comes back with a drug problem. He comes back with this drug problem, and then he ends up in a rehab. He ends up dying at a very young age. And at his funeral, Jackie Robinson makes the statement that, you know, what did I think I was doing by trying to protect these kids if I couldn't protect my own? Right? And so we kind of see this kind of very complicated space. And I'm not saying that these programs are bad inherently. I think they're all well-intended. But they do require us to kind of look at what they're ultimately doing, right? Because what we do with a lot of programs like PAL, like the YMCAs, like My Brother's Keeper, right, is that we end up seeing kind of these spaces kind of create this good kid, bad kid binary, right? And the good kids are the ones that show up, right? The bad kids we can't reach, right? And so it's sort of this conundrum that these prevention efforts ultimately kind of face. And so the progress that we see made in some of these prevention efforts, right? Because I do think this is well intended, right? As problematic as the results ultimately turn out, I do think these potential solves, right, or these potential resolutions are well intended. But the progress that we see made in the 1950s is ultimately met by institutionalized racism by the 60s, right? Obviously, we're familiar enough with the rhetoric of the war on crime, but we see even in the 1960s the birth of policies like stop and frisk, right? The police become much more aggressive. In New York City, stop and frisk hits the books in 1964. Right? It's still around today, right? Even though it's been designated unconstitutional for 6 decades, right? And so even before the war on crime, right, the stakes are clear that race was going to be the crucial determinant in American notions of crime and delinquency, and that black youth would be condemned with this stigma of criminality as they continue to confront the overwhelming power of the state. And so just kind of as a quick aside before we dive into Q&A, I did want to spend a little bit of time answering kind of the so what, right? Like I always ask my students, right? So you have this historical argument, so what, right? What's at stake? And so, yes, my forthcoming book examines how the juvenile justice system and its associated authorities contributed to racialized constructions of youth criminality between the 1930s and 1960s, right? But so what, right? And so a part of why I like opening with the Campanella Jr. story or the David Campanella story is it shows us that he could not be protected from his parents' status, all right, or his own kind of elevated status. And this hasn't actually changed much, right? Economists have found that race continues to trump class, at least when it comes to incarcerations of youth in the United States, right? In other words, right, what these numbers ultimately show, and this is a study done by Derek Hamilton, a professor of economics, and what they found was that in recent decades, rich black kids were actually more likely to have spent time in prison than poor white ones. Right? And so in fact, what their numbers point to was that it's around 2.7% of the poorest young white people that were documented in relation to roughly 10% of the most affluent black youths that are documented, right? Class isn't protecting them from spending time in prisons, right? This is a long longitudinal study. A piece of it was published in the Washington Post, and I remember when it comes up, I had so many people in like my social media networks reposting this, like, oh my God, this is crazy. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's been this way and been kind of on this trajectory for quite a while because the policy is intended for this to kind of play out. Even beyond economists, right? Psychologists have determined that black boys are seen as older and less innocent than their white counterparts, right? And it's kind of hard to read here, but this was an article that came out in 2014, led by Phil Goff, who recently left UCLA to co-found and serve as president of Center for Policing Equity at John Jay. And they see that black boys aren't given the protection of childhood, not equal to their white peers, right? And not only did they find that they were seen as less innocent, but they were perceived to be more responsible for their actions, right? Or being more appropriate targets for police violence. And then finally, I mean, we live in an age of social media, right? And black youth can talk about their own experience. So even as we see black youth in the 21st century really begin to articulate their own experience with carceral authorities, many remain surprised by the disparities between black and white youths, right? And these contemporary studies ultimately illustrate a much longer history of these policies, of these strategies that did target specific communities since the first decades of the 20th century. And so I do hope after the book comes out that somebody somewhere will read it and be convinced the same way that I was, right? That this was kind of this has been kind of a long time coming. And so I'll use the remainder of the time to field any questions, comments, responses that you guys might have. I also have another OAH promo that gives 30% plus free shipping, but you have to buy it in the OAH window. We can talk after if you want that one. But thank you.